If your parents raised you in the 1970s, their mindset was completely different from anything that exists today. You can sense it in how they talk about childhood, how they react when modern parents panic over things they never thought twice about, the way they shrug off what today would be considered dangerous, that quiet certainty that children are more capable than everyone thinks. Whether you're trying to understand why they shaped you the way they did, or you were one of these parents making sense of your own instincts, what you're about to learn is going to reframe everything. Because 1970s parents operated from a psychological framework that created something extraordinary. Yes, they raised some of the most resilient, self-reliant children in modern history. But here's what nobody talks about. That same framework also shaped you in ways that are more complex than simple nostalgia suggests. The independence came with particular patterns around connection. The toughness shaped how emotions get processed. The freedom came with things that went unspoken and unaddressed. And trust me, by the end of this video, you're going to understand both sides of that coin. Because that belief that kids were tougher, that hands-off approach, it didn't come from nowhere. Your parents were operating under forces that shaped not just how much freedom they gave you, but how emotionally available they could be while giving it. Let's start with your mother. She was caught in a psychological trap that nobody even had words for yet. The women's movement was happening around her, telling her she could have a career, could want more than domestic life, could claim her own identity beyond wife and mother. But the cultural expectations hadn't actually shifted to match that message. She was still expected to have a spotless house, still expected to have dinner on the table, still expected to make it look effortless. Society was telling her she could do anything while simultaneously judging her harshly if she didn't do everything. Work if you want, but don't let the house fall apart. Have ambitions, but don't neglect your children. Be independent, but don't emasculate your husband. And here's how that connects to the freedom you experienced. Sending you outside for hours wasn't just about believing kids needed independence. For some mothers, it was also the only way to survive those impossible expectations. The benign neglect that built your resilience was also sometimes her psychological survival strategy. Maybe your mum was emotionally available some days and completely checked out others. Maybe she snapped at you over small things because she was holding an enormous frustration. Maybe she seemed resentful in ways you couldn't understand as a child because you didn't know she was mourning possibilities she'd been told existed but couldn't actually access. The mothers who did work faced even more complexity. No paid maternity leave, no workplace flexibility, judgment from every direction, and that same belief that kids were tougher, that they could handle things, that became the permission structure for these mothers to work without collapsing under guilt. And your father? His psychology was almost the opposite problem. While your mother was being pulled in contradictory directions, your father's identity was dangerously narrow. He was the provider, the disciplinarian, the authority figure. His entire sense of self-worth was built on his ability to earn money and command respect. Those roles left almost no room for emotional complexity. But here's the connection. That same belief system that said kids need to figure things out on their own, that struggle builds character, that came directly from how these men were raised. Men in the 1970s were not taught emotional language. They weren't encouraged to explore feelings or express vulnerability. That was systematic psychological training that started when they were boys. Don't cry, toughen up, be a man. Emotions were weakness, and weakness was unacceptable. So when your father let you climb that tree without hovering, when he watched you figure out problems on your own, when he didn't rush in to comfort you every time you got hurt, he wasn't being cold. He was replicating the exact training he'd received. The same toughness that was beaten into him, he was now packaging as freedom and giving to you. Your father came home from work and sat in silence, not because he didn't love you, but because he had no framework for expressing it. The distance wasn't personal rejection. He showed love by providing financially, by being present physically, by protecting the family structure, a hand on your shoulder, showing up to your game without saying much. Those were the only expressions of care he'd been taught to recognize. This came from somewhere real. Your parents' parents survived the Depression and World War II. They raised children where emotional restraint was survival and toughness was necessary. You didn't dwell on feelings because dwelling didn't change circumstances. But that emotional distance created something else, something nobody mentions when they talk about the good old days of the 1970s. That same hands-off philosophy created space for things to happen in those homes that nobody had language for. Things that were common enough to be almost ordinary, but significant enough that they shaped how a lot of people relate to the world today. Alcoholism wasn't called a disease. It was just how Dad was after work. Kids learned to read their parents' mood by the number of empty bottles or the sound of ice in a glass. They developed hyper-vigilance from unpredictability. Physical punishment wasn't questioned. Spanking, belts, wooden spoons. These weren't considered abuse. They were discipline. When your father hit you for talking back, the neighbours were nodding in agreement that kids needed to learn respect. There was no conversation about whether this was teaching certain lessons about power and safety. Marital conflict played out in front of children without anyone considering the impact. Parents screamed at each other during dinner, doors slammed, sometimes dishes broke, and kids sat on staircases listening, learning that this was what adult relationships looked like. That anger was normal, that contempt was just part of marriage. Mental health problems went completely untreated. Depression was just being tired, anxiety was being high-strung. Your mother's emotional unavailability wasn't postpartum depression. Your father's rage wasn't PTSD. These conditions existed without diagnosis, without treatment, without even acknowledgement that something was wrong. And divorce carried such stigma that kids often felt shameful just by having separated parents. No family therapy, no co-parenting frameworks, just custody arrangements that felt arbitrary, and children who internalized the failure of their parents' marriage as somehow their responsibility. But here's what compounded everything: the silence. Children experienced these things without any adult helping them process what they meant. No one explained that Dad's drinking wasn't your fault. No one told you that the physical punishment was about your parents' inability to regulate emotions, not about your worthiness of love. So kids did what humans do. They made sense of things with the information available. They learned to be hyper-independent because depending on adults felt unreliable. They learned to suppress emotions because expressing them led to punishment. They learned to manage other people's feelings because their own stability sometimes depended on it. This is the other side of that independence everyone celebrates. Some of that self-reliance developed not just from freedom, but from necessity. The ability to handle everything alone because asking for help wasn't always an option. And that framework extended into how discipline itself was structured. Your parents didn't just limit emotional expression, they built an entire discipline system around unquestioned obedience. Because I said so wasn't lazy parenting to them. It was a complete parenting philosophy. Children weren't supposed to understand the reasons behind rules, they were supposed to follow them. Questioning authority wasn't critical thinking development. It was disrespect that needed to be shut down immediately. Your parents genuinely thought that children who learned to obey without questioning would become adults who functioned well in hierarchical systems: school, work, military, marriage. They were preparing you for a world where authority was absolute and your job was to comply. Clear hierarchy created security. Rigid boundaries meant predictability, and predictability meant safety, especially in homes where other things felt chaotic. But that same system that created stability might have also shaped how you relate to authority now. You may have learned particular patterns about when your reasoning matters, when your perspective holds weight, what the right answer is when it conflicts with someone in power. Some of you might have become expert people pleasers. You learned to read what authority figures wanted and deliver it before they even had to ask. Maybe you can sense what other people want from you with almost psychic accuracy, but you're not always sure what you actually want for yourself. Others perhaps went the opposite direction. You might have developed a strong resistance to authority of any kind, built an identity around being contrarian, pushing back, refusing to comply because obedience itself feels like losing something essential. And then there's conflict avoidance. If disagreement was treated as disrespect in your childhood home, you may have learned particular patterns around confrontation. You might be someone who will go to great lengths to avoid conflict because somewhere deep in your nervous system, it still registers differently than it does for others. Your parents thought they were teaching respect, but they were also teaching specific lessons about voice, power, and authenticity. They were replicating the only system they knew, operating from beliefs about obedience and hierarchy that felt like facts rather than choices. Here's what you need to understand. Everything that made you strong, and everything that shaped your psychology came from the exact same place. The independence that lets you handle crisis is the same independence that makes asking for help feel unnatural. The emotional stoicism that created toughness also shaped how you express feelings. The freedom that built confidence sometimes forced early maturity. You can't separate them because your parents couldn't separate them either. The self-reliance is real. The toughness serves you brilliantly. The capability is genuine. But these traits come with their own texture. Sometimes that self-reliance means you default to handling things alone. Sometimes that toughness means emotions take longer to surface. Sometimes that capability becomes the mode you operate in even when you don't need to. The same hands-off approach that taught resilience also meant processing things independently. The same emphasis on independence that made you capable also shaped how you connect. This isn't about blame. Your parents were doing exactly what they thought was right with the tools they had. They were products of beliefs so deeply embedded they didn't even recognize them as choices. They genuinely believed they were improving on how they were raised, and in many ways they were. You inherited something complex and fascinating, a psychology that's distinctly different from what came before or after. And here's what's fascinating. These patterns didn't stop with you. If you're a parent yourself, you're probably making your own adjustments, keeping what worked, changing what didn't, each generation trying to preserve the strengths while adapting the approach. The 1970s parents operated from beliefs that felt like facts. Children are resilient. Independence builds character. Emotional restraint is strength. Those beliefs created remarkable capabilities in you, a generation unlike any that came before or will come after. The freedom, the resilience, the self-reliance, it's real and it's extraordinary. Your parents gave you what they had to give. Sometimes that was exactly what you needed. Sometimes it was something else. All of that shaped who you are without anyone being the villain. Now that you understand where it came from, you get to decide how you move forward with it.